Hello, my friends and fellow soul defenders. My name is Christy, and this is Soul Bruises, a podcast devoted to taking a closer look at spiritual abuse. In a previous podcast, I laid out a list of 12 spiritual abuse behaviors and tactics. In episode 6, we talked about the first tactic of deception and lies. Given that deception lies at the core of spiritual abuse, it was fitting to address that first. Today's episode, we're going to dive into the second spiritual abuse tactic of power. I'm thankful you've chosen to tune in, and I hope you find something valuable in the conversation and exploration. I acknowledge that this material can be triggering and traumatizing for some individuals, so please consider your mental health before you choose to listen. If at any point you feel uncomfortable about the content due to past or present trauma, please do not ignore what your body is telling you and choose the decision that is best for you to make. Please know that you are not alone and that I'm here to support you. One of the main objectives of this podcast is to get educational information on spiritual abuse out there so that we can know how to recognize and expose it for what it is. I hope that as you listen to more episodes regarding this issue, that you feel motivated to join with me in becoming an advocate for change. Together, we can take steps forward to prevent the growing number of victims of this abuse to keep rising. I personally believe I have a responsibility to make this world a kinder place, and I hope you feel the same way. So here I am, and here you are. So let's talk. The first tactic addressed in episode 6 was that of deception and lies. Theologian and philosopher St. Augustine said, quote, "Truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose and it will defend itself." End quote. We discovered in the context of spiritual abuse that often truth is hidden or disguised through the act of deception and lies, for the purpose of protecting the abuser and blaming the victim, further traumatizing them. Often this tactic is camouflaged, leading to a "look over there, not here," or "there's nothing to see here" approach. In the face of truth, deception and lies are exposed. Not always in the short term, but in the long run, this exposure can lead to healing. Some wounds are severe and take time, which is why bringing the abuse into the light, as ugly as it is, can be a step in the right direction. In today's episode, we will be exploring tactic number 2, which centers around the concept of power. As I dove into the research on spiritual abuse, I noticed 3 specific tactics that seem to be so closely intertwined with each other. I decided to group them together and call them the spiritual abuse triad. These tactics are power, control, and authority. Here is how closely defined the spiritual abuse triad is. Power is the ability to influence the behavior and action of others, either directly or indirectly, including empowering others to do what they need to do to influence others. Control is the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. It often involves regulation, manipulation, or domination of circumstances or individuals to achieve a desired outcome or maintain order. Authority takes the power and the right it has to give orders, then makes decisions and enforces obedience. Because of this, it is often given to those holding leadership positions. Authority gives individuals the ability to influence and direct the actions or behaviors of others. Working in concert with each other for the greater good, these concepts can lead to significant positive changes and dynamic leadership. But when used for their personal gain or for evil, a weapon of destruction. Addressing each element individually becomes crucial and preventing the dark side of these entities to seize control and take hold of a person or an organization. Although power, control, and authority are closely intertwined, each possesses distinct characteristics that warrant a more thorough investigation. Over the next few episodes, we will parse out these detailed differences by examining each of these tactics separately to discern their unique characteristics, as well as to explore their shared commonalities and mutual connections. Despite their positive traits, it's crucial to acknowledge the dark side of power, control, and authority, especially in the context of abuse. It's in the context of abuse that this dark side manifests its greatest display of ugliness. When power, control, and authority play in concert in this dissonant way, their melody is unbearable to listen to. So in this episode, let's talk about power in the context of spiritual abuse. Power is defined as the capacity to influence people, including empowering others to do what they need to do to influence others. It possesses the inherent potential to guide or shape the action of others. The reality is that every single one of us can and does exhibit a degree of power, from the smallest infant to the president of a country. Every single one of us has an influence on the world around us, some more than others. Those who do have significant power have greater opportunity and a higher responsibility to use that power for the good of others. However, with that power also comes the potential and opportunity for abuse and the oppression of others. Some have used their significant influence and have chosen to inflict harm rather than impart good. So many times, spiritual abuse happens at the hand of this mismatched power dynamic used for harm. It's important to note that most relationships have some form of power dynamic, and the distribution of that power is constantly negotiated between the parties involved. Abuse happens when one party seeks to exploit this power dynamic by exerting control over the other, prioritizing their own personal power above all else. Let's take, for example, relationships like the parent-child dynamic, where there is an obvious power imbalance. Because of this, there will be an ongoing struggle to navigate these power dynamics. Speaking from personal parenting experience, I can attest to the ongoing struggle in finding that balanced approach in handling those power dynamics. If you've parented a 3-year-old or a teenager, I know you know that of which I speak. It's a constant struggle for that perfect balance. It's advantageous to find a healthy balance in a power dynamic. The need to have things our way is all too enticing. Living in a healthy space with fellow human beings on this planet demands constant exploration around navigating and negotiating these complicated power dynamics with each other. This does not exclude our interaction with spiritual leaders and how that mismatch can lead to instances of spiritual abuse. In the book Pivot by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer, they stated that, quote, "The single most important practice in transforming a church culture is a Christ-like exercise of power," end quote. As this episode focuses on the spiritual leaders of these church cultures, the way they use their power will say a lot about the character and integrity they possess. Presbyterian minister and TV star of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Fred Rogers, showed how you can have a captive audience for 33 years, possess the power of that consistent influence, and yet inspire rather than dominate, enrich rather than overbear, love rather than rule. Pastor Fred used his power to come alongside, lift up, and inspire others through his humble and simple influence. In their book, Pivot, McKnight and Barringer spell out 4 approaches to power. They are that of powering over, powering with, powering for, and powering through. Similar to spiritual abuse, powering exists on a spectrum, with powering over at one extreme and powering through on the other end. Particularly concerning spiritual leaders, it's important to recognize that clergy do hold a unique authority position over others in their congregations. This makes it tempting to them to adopt a powering over approach. They have the leverage, the authority, and the position to assert dominance over members of the congregation. While not all clergy exploit this power dynamic, those that spiritually abuse use this lopsided power dynamic for their needs, their prestige, their selfish desires, and sometimes to just be a bully. And bullies capitalize on the bullying of those whom they see as beneath them. It isn't about you or the church. It's exclusively about them. They have misused that position of power, leadership, and influence to further the selfish interest of themselves, rather than the individuals who need help. Chuck DeGroot, in his book, When Narcissism Comes to Church, explains how the combination of spirituality and the abuse of power can be so toxic. He stated, quote, "Spiritual and emotional abuse have much in common, but spiritual abuse bears a particularly sinister twist, as principles and maxims of faith are wielded as weapons of command and control, and faith leaders abuse their power for the sake of feeding their own unmet emotional needs. The victim feels just as perplexed and confused as one who has experienced emotional abuse, but experiences it from a seemingly more authoritative source, a holy source." End quote. Because of this, victims can find themselves confused and disoriented, experiencing manipulation and control from those they saw as holy. In this process, those abusing this power dynamic in the name of God exploit trust, faith, and vulnerability over those victimized, leaving profound scars on both individuals and communities. Although I will be speaking about authority, I did want to state here that a shared trait amongst many spiritual leaders and pastors is their perceived possession of divine authority. They feel that, and many state that, they speak for God. This can inadvertently lead some to believe that whatever is spoken by them is spoken with God's authority, and that as a result, they have the power to do what they want by nature of their position in the church. This belief can lead to a self-centered spiritual leader at the very least, and a spiritual abuser at the very worst. A pastor or spiritual leader has a significant capacity to influence others. Some use that for harm, knowing full well that they are abusing their power, while others may abuse that power without even realizing it. Still others are using that power that they do have for good. I will speak to the remaining 3 approaches to power briefly. They are powering with, powering for, and powering through. Anne Marie Slaughter, international lawyer, foreign policy analyst, political scientist, and public commentator, stated, quote, "Power shared is not the same as power delegated. It is shared within the give and take of a human relationship." End quote. Sharing power resembles a power with stance. Its characteristics are, quote, "that feedback flows in both directions. Those under you know they are trusted and can express what they think needs to change, and that you, the leader, are accountable to them as they are to you." End quote. For the leader, it requires humility to allow others' gifts to shine. People tend to thrive under such a stance because they feel appreciated. Power 4 is about us becoming servants, just as Christ was when he came to this earth. It was best described by the author of Pivot when they were describing Jesus' approach to Power 4. They explained it as, quote, power he had, power over he could have exercised. Jesus exemplified Power 4 because he used his power for others, divesting himself so it could benefit others. He gave himself to redeem others from their sin and death, end quote. Though we cannot in our humanness redeem others from sin and death, we have the opportunity to use our power to serve and benefit others. Lastly, power through goes beyond power over, with, and for. You have power as an individual. Barringer and McKnight described it this way, quote, you can use that power over someone to accomplish what you want, or you can work with others and exercise power with in a shared fashion. And you could go further by using your power for someone else's good, end quote. The power through, according to Barringer and McKnight, is the power that is granted by God that moves through you into another so that they can be transformed. They stated that, quote, this is the ultimate form of divine power, the release of God's power to us and through us into others, so they can extend the mission of Jesus even further, end quote. For those that have experienced the abuse of power over to the extent of spiritual abuse, often do not trust the other forms of power implemented. Their walls are so far up in protection against the power over that other forms seem hollow when applied. Trust is tarnished in the process, and the relationship falls on shaky ground. When healthy, the body of Christ can grow together into a healthy family system, where we learn to lean on each other for strength and encouragement, creating an environment where trust can grow, where the power dynamics are negotiated in ways that lead to a healthier church, community, and family. When there is a breakdown in those power dynamics, it leads to an abuse of power that corrupts the health of any system. Clinical psychologist Diane Langberg warns, quote, abusive power violates and shatters relationships. It brings betrayal, fear, humiliation, loss of dignity, and shame. It isolates, endangers, creates barriers, and destroys bonds. It destroys empathy, trashes safety, and severs connection. Abusive power has a profound impact on our relationship with God and with others. Abuse of power is a cancer in the body of Christ, end quote. Abuse of power, the Pivot authors stated, was, quote, the deadliest toxin in a church soil, end quote. What are we doing with the power we possess? How can we use that power that we do have for good? How, if there is a corruption of power, do we act as a body or a community of believers? Since we all have the ability to possess power, what we do with it demonstrates to others a lot about our character. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, certainly influenced the course of events in a mighty way. His leadership during the Civil War, which was one of the saddest times in the United States history, was nothing short of heroic. There's a quote that is awfully wrongly credited to Lincoln, but instead it was written by an orator and author named Robert G. Ingersoll about Lincoln. The quote went something like this: nothing discloses real character like the use of power. It is easy for the weak to be gentle. Most people can bear adversity. But if you wish to know what a man really is, give him power. This is the supreme test. It is the glory of Lincoln that, having almost absolute power, He never abused it, except on the side of mercy." End quote. It is no wonder that Lincoln is viewed in such high esteem. If you wish to know what a man really is, give him power. Here we had an honorable individual that had the capacity and ability to direct and influence the behavior of others and the course of really significant events. Yet he did not take advantage of that opportunity and cause harm. It's no wonder his face is on Mount Rushmore. Pittacus of Mytilene, who was an ancient Mytilene military general and one of the 7 sages of Greece, was quoted as saying, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." End quote. That can certainly pertain to all of us. Power misused is power abused. What do we want our legacy to say about our use of power? In the book A Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight, he wrote, quote, "Perhaps the most common temptation for church leaders is to wield their assumed authority and position as weapons of lethal, wounding power. When a leader manifests the power hatchet, a culture is formed that adjusts to the blade of fear. Power and fear are close companions. Combine that with narcissism, and a toxic culture is sure to form." End quote. In the case of the abuse of power, the ego is surely driving. What the person wants becomes their greatest need, and they will take whatever steps necessary to achieve it. Deepak Chopra expressed, quote, "Power means having the ability to control circumstances to your benefit, to manipulate or dominate people in order to get your own way. If what you want is the greatest good for everyone, ego has little to say." End quote. The ego in a spiritually abusive person steers the vehicle. For the leader that uses power in a healthy manner, they allow their ego to step aside for the greater good. There is this concept called the hubris syndrome. I'd certainly heard of hubris, but wasn't familiar with this syndrome. It is, as author Scott McKnight describes, quote, "a disorder of possession of power, particularly power which has been associated with overwhelming success, held for a period of years and with minimal constraint on the learners. Such self-controlled hubris may cause the personal character of the power-shaped pastor to lose contact with the very essences of Christianity." End quote. When the focus shifts to the excessive pride and self-confidence of a spiritual leader, abuse is just an act waiting to happen. I'll speak more about this in the podcast on spiritual narcissism. This was and is most notably present in the life of American evangelical pastor Mark Driscoll. He was the founder and senior pastor of the now dissolved Mars Hill Church. Despite his charisma, he was a bully, misogynistic, authoritarian, and homophobic. He took the power that he was given as a senior pastor to lord over his congregants and those working with and for him. The organization of Acts 29 that he'd helped found, later at the request of its board members, he was removed from its membership and urged to step down from the ministry and get help. Rather than comply, he resigned, rebranded himself, and established another church. He is currently the lead pastor of the Trinity Church in Scottsdale, Arizona. Without accountability, humility, or genuine change, he will likely repeat these same patterns of behavior. This narrative is extensively chronicled in detail in the podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, offering a comprehensive case study of a spiritual leader and his abuse of power. In the podcast The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, The Mark Driscoll saga is told from numerous accounts and witnesses sharing what went on to cause these huge issues. If you have the courage to listen to them, they offer a broader perspective of this gentleman's modus operandi and how it resembles other cases of spiritual abuse. Driscoll's ministry thrived on the power he was given, demanded, and misused to maintain control. His ministry is an illustration of how charisma, hubris, and chaos mix, and the byproduct is a sludge of disgust. When there is an imbalance of power, staff are often seen as subordinates of the leader of these environments. Any sort of empowerment of that staff is a threat to the abusive spiritual leader's power and control. Thus, while everyone possesses a degree of power that can be used in healthy ways, that is squelched due to the hubris of the abusive leader and their inability to coincide with others' ability to influence. Power can be like salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier one gets. A manifestation of spiritual abuse that involves power is that which involves the power of men over women. This is frequently found in patriarchal systems, where the men are elevated in the organization to a higher status of power, control, and authority than women are. Such dynamics are present in churches predominantly led by men, many which adhere to the concept of complementarianism. This ideology states that men and women have different but complementary roles and responsibilities in marriage, family, and religious leadership. I know this can be a delicate and tricky topic, but one I plan to delve into with a future bonus episode. An abusive male spiritual leader, whose power has been given to him by man rather than divine authority, might distort Scripture to justify his dominance. But God does not call for humans to have dominion over each other, but over the animals, not man over woman, nor a woman over a man. It's evident that some male leaders find it challenging, even threatening, to embrace female leadership within their own church circles. My own denomination still struggles with this, in that a female prophet can be revered and granted elevated authority status, yet women are still barred from ordination across the denomination. One can't help but question whether these barriers are rooted in tradition, discrimination, or an arrogant thirst for power. Throughout history, many female spiritual leaders have and are spreading the gospel of love and advancing the cause of good in the world. Yet I feel that the ordination process becomes more of a power grab rather than a true calling to the ministry, when it discriminates who can and can't lead others to Christ. One of the first ministers of the gospel was the woman at the well. Let that sink in. Are our traditions, discriminations, and biases driving our hesitancy, or is it our inflated egos and lust for power? Such attitudes blocked the minds and hearts of the Pharisees in biblical times. They were the spiritual leaders of Jesus' day, yet were threatened by the very presence, words, and actions of Christ, because in many ways, his ways were radical. What threatens our spiritual leaders today? We are all created to be image bearers of Christ, and yet if we take our status to indicate that we are more important in the sight of God because of that status, we are downright fools. And when we believe in such nonsense, it leads to us decreasing the humanity of our fellow brother and sister. In the book Redeeming Power by Diane Langberg, she wrote, quote, "When we cloud God's image, it's easy for us to treat people as less than. Abusers then only know two ways to use power: to protect themselves because they are vulnerable, and to exploit others because they are vulnerable." End quote. Because the abuser has a complicated relationship with their own sense of vulnerability, and because they see the image of another as less than, covering up, projecting shame, or exploiting the vulnerability of another becomes their modus operandi. They sometimes pursue power to protect themselves against the very vulnerability that threatens them so intensely. It's important to remember that the abuser's exploitation of a vulnerable person tells us more about their character than the one being exploited. Vulnerability and power are intertwined, engaged in a dance that is sometimes beautiful and sometimes destructive, Diane Langberg adds. End quote. I believe what determines whether there will be a harmful or healthy waltz performed is determined in who we choose to choreograph that dance. Who are the spiritual leaders who can dance with that combination most effectively? When spiritual leaders are driven by their desire to be powerful, be amazing, be important, even to the extent of being a celebrity, they have drunk what Dutch Catholic priest, professor, writer, and theologian Henry Nouwen described as, quote, the toxic cocktail refused by Jesus in his wilderness temptation, but gladly embraced by many pastors today, end quote. Infamous cult leader Jim Jones, who through his abuse of power, his skill of coercion, and his charismatic spirit, led 900 people to drink the deadly Kool-Aid, leading to a murderous and suicidal massacre of gigantic proportions, a spiritual holocaust that is in a league of its own. Jones was a prime example of an abusive leader driven by hubris. There are many in his wake that have followed down the same destructive path of leadership. The specific concepts of power, control, and authority are fed lavishly in the cultish environment. I will just touch on a few power aspects of cults and dig deeper into the world of cults in a future episode. Power corrupted Jim Jones. This is often the case where there is a hyper-focus on a charismatic leader. Their ideology becomes the law of the cult. Through their charm and charisma and the gift of articulation, they coerce their followers to follow them with unquestioning obedience. A dependency is created through this admiration of the leader, and whatever the leader says goes. After all, the leader speaks for God. The consequences of such circumstances under the influence of a power-hungry leader are disastrous. It's important to recognize we all can be corrupted by power. We all can fall prey to the seductive allure of a charismatic, spiritual cult leader. We are naive to think otherwise. When we have any bit of doubt, and along comes someone that exudes confidence and certainty, it's far too easy to yield to their influence. We have to make an intentional effort to discern whether their instruction and leadership is sound. We must know the difference between healthy power and abusive power, so we don't succumb to the coercive, charismatic leader with ulterior, spiritually abusive motives. Within religious cults, there's a common claim that God holds the ultimate authority. However, as time unfolds, the sinister cult leader succumbs to the temptation of equating themselves with God, or even saying they are God themselves. They abandon humility altogether. Tragically, this dangerous shift toward conceit and self-admiration can lead to unimaginable levels of horror, such as in the case of Jim Jones and the senseless murder of 900 innocent human beings. The leader of a cult decides everything about the group, how it is run, who does what, the rules and regulations, the ideas, when things change, and how they change. everything is chosen by the leader to suit him, herself. They answer to no one regardless of whether there is a governing body in place. The leader has the final say. They hold absolute power. Described as a man of great learning, with a deep devotion to individual liberty and a profound understanding of history, Lord Acton was famous for the quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," end quote. With the wrong motives, it would appear that increased personal power can potentially lead to the diminishing of someone's sense of morality. One significant area where corruptive power exists among Christians today is in the realm of politics, especially in the area of Christian nationalism. The marriage of our love for Christ and our love for country is feeding into our hubristic tendencies. While there is nothing wrong with loving both Christ and our country, giving them equal levels of authority in our hearts and minds has had disastrous consequences. While politics is in the secular realm, some religious individuals exploit the power it offers, yet hide behind their dogma when attacked or criticized. We have many leaders in this country from many walks of life. Being a spiritual, religious, or Christian person shouldn't exclude you from being involved in the politics of your country. Throughout history and into present day, the church has often sought to bolster its influence by aligning with governmental powers to advance their personal agendas. For example, the Jewish leaders who went to the Roman government seeking to have Jesus killed, knowing they didn't have the power to do so, but knowing where to get that power, and then exploiting it for their gain. Adolf Hitler also leveraged the church of his day to strengthen his persecution of the Jews. We also face struggles in this realm throughout our difficulty in keeping a separation between the church and state within matters of government. If what's driving us is our wants and desires, then we often care no mind to others' views, perspectives, or humanity. When we are pursuing power, specifically when it is being used for harm, the very foundational values of Christianity are compromised, which in turn speak to the integrity of our faith and beliefs. Are you familiar with the phrase, "Who died and made you king?" You may have heard it when one person is lording over others in a group in such a manner that the others in the group feel as if they are just peasant subjects who cannot make decisions on their own. They feel powerless. The reality is that Jesus is spiritual royalty, and yet he used his power to do the exact opposite of that. Even Jesus' disciples thought he was going to be a king that ruled over all. But Jesus flipped the script on humanity. We had our own perspectives and expectations. He came to show how power is truly used in the way he expressed himself with it in the short 33 years he was here on this earth. Jesus epitomized how to display power and humility simultaneously. There is a story in the Bible about how Jesus came to the well for water and found a Samaritan woman who had been dehumanized on so many levels. She was hated for her ethnicity, her gender, and the immoral nature of her circumstances. Jesus valued her, treated her with respect and kindness. He saw her for the image bearer she was created to be. He saw her power. He saw her mission. He saw her. And because of that, he showed immense compassion and grace, all the while in that moment preparing her for her mission moving forward. Instead of using his power to power over, he woke up the power that she was born with. He empowered her. Big difference. Again, from the book Redeeming Power by Dr. Langberg, which I highly suggest you read, it said, quote, "The power of a person is found in the very image of Jesus. not in the brilliance, gifting, knowledge, position, verbal power, reputation, or fame. Jesus used power not to rule, but to influence, to invite, to welcome, to transform. When we are in Christ, no nationality, no government, no race, no gender, no status, and no prejudice rules our choices and actions. To be in His image in this world is to live and look like the one we call Lord." End quote. Healing awaits for those that have been subjected to the corruption of power that has led to abusive acts by a spiritual leader. But like a wound that needs to be debrided for the enhancement of healing, the corruption of power has to be addressed and often uprooted. The abuse must be exposed. The corruption of power must be called out. Ultimately, the health of a church depends on the relationship its leaders have with power. What they do with it shows their character, shows their relationship with it. So observe it. A sobering side note. In the book, A Church Called Tove, the author explains that, quote, "Recent research has uncovered some alarming evidence of the effects that power has on the human brain. They, the ones in power, acted as if they had suffered a traumatic brain injury, becoming more impulsive, less risk-aware, and crucially, less adept at seeing things from other people's point of view." End quote. Do our church give our leaders too much power? In doing that, does it tempt leaders to abuse that power? Does it lead them to want more and more power? That ultimately depends on the character of the leader. Why do religious leaders abuse their power? Several thoughts out there are this. Perhaps they are naive to what level of experience they need for their position, which in turn affects their judgment and decision-making abilities. This can lead to the undoing of a church, group, or individual because of this immaturity. On the other end of the spectrum, some leaders go on a power trip, which can be both intoxicating and addictive. Having power can be exhilarating, and some, once they have this feeling, want it more. This insatiable craving for power leads them also down a dangerous path of needing their egos fed constantly. Some abusive leaders have few boundaries, no guardrails to maintain personal or spiritual accountability. Without these boundaries, there are no checks and balances, and they so easily travel down a path of abusing the power they've been given. Then there is a situation where the leader has created a platform that then outgrows the skills, experience, and character of the leader. This can lead to the erosion of the leader's confidence, who in turn may compensate for that by abusing the power they do have. Sometimes it's a situation where the leader creates an environment where no one challenges him. There is no one telling when and where they might be out of line. Instead, they agree with everything the leader wants to do. When no one challenges you, it's easy to lose perspective and abuse power. A leader that abuses power avoids taking accountability, that in turn frees them up to abuse their power without consequences. Stan Lee, Marvel comic creator, said this, quote, "With great power comes great responsibility." End quote. It came from a 1st century BC parable of the sword of Damocles and the medieval principle noblesse oblige. Quote, "The principle that power cannot simply be enjoyed for its privileges alone, but necessarily makes its holders morally responsible both for what they choose to do with it and for what they fail to do with it. It refers to the obligation of anyone who is in a better position than others, such as a position with greater power, to act respectfully and responsibly, both in their actions and inactions, recognizing their advantageous position relative to others." End quote. If I have but one listener to this podcast, I have the power to influence that person. It is highly important for me to constantly and consistently evaluate and reevaluate the power of this platform. We all, whether we acknowledge it or not, have a platform. The human beings around us are influenced by the power we possess. We can influence the world around us through kindness towards others, or we can use it for our own selfish gain and cause harm at the expense of another person. The choice is ours. In his humility, Jesus exhibited the ultimate display of power. He did so in his service to others while he was on the earth. Instead of overpowering, he empowered people. Instead of rising to be an earthly king, he lowered himself in service for mankind. It would behoove, at the very least, Christ's followers to follow this example. During a summer visit to Independence Hall in Philadelphia, my family and I joined a tour group exploring the historical building. Among our tour group were some students from a nearby school. As we were brought into the room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed many years ago, there was a noisy chatter. The tour guide, dressed in his National Park green garb, walked to the front of the room and turned around and faced us. For what felt like eternity, we sat in silence, waiting for him to speak. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he spoke. He had been waiting until there was complete silence and reverent space because of the room we were in. He was wanting to honor the place where something very important in the United States had happened. The tour guide had used the power of silence to honor, and I've never forgotten that. So what will we do with the power we possess? Will we use it to honor and serve others? Will we empower human souls around us with it? Or will we drink the salt water of power ourselves and thirst for more? As we discovered, power has both positive and negative effects. It is highly important that we critically analyze the power dynamics within our religious institutions, recognizing where there is genuine spiritual leadership or a harmful manipulation of the power by the leader. Will we allow the abuses of power in our religious institutions, communities, or churches to continue reaping negative effects? Or will we strive to empower or negotiate in good faith the personal powers we all possess, taking into consideration each other's perspectives and agency? As we move forward and explore the remaining members of the spiritual abuse triad, those of control and authority, I hope you'll be able to see how important these entities can be and how you can have a tremendous positive influence on the human beings around you. At the same time, see the abusive dark side of each of these and how they can be intended for harm. Quote, "Power is dangerous," Ragnar Lothbrok stated. "It corrupts the best and attracts the worst. Power is only given to those who are prepared to lower themselves to pick it up." End quote. In the book Bully Pulpit by Michael J. Kruger, he suggests that, quote, "The best way to stop abusive pastors is never let them achieve positions of power in the first place." And goes on to say that the church needs to rethink the way it attracts and recruits pastoral candidates so potentially abusive leaders are weeded out from the start. End quote. I would encourage anyone that's in church leadership to read this book, and particularly this section regarding on how to go about doing that. Nothing will produce 100% safety for a church. But if an organization is serious about combating the abuse of power in their community, doing all you can is better than doing nothing in the face of obvious abuse of power. I hope you've heard something here that's been helpful. Evaluating these tactics and behaviors gives us all an opportunity to reflect on our own behaviors. We all possess a degree of power. What we do with it matters. If you have any further thoughts you want to share on this topic or others that have been discussed in this podcast, reach out to me at soulbruises@gmail.com or on Instagram at soulbruises2023. This is Christy, and you've been listening to the Soul Bruises podcast. Until next time, be human, be kind, be both.